Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing Dr. Geoffrey Deibel, professor of saxophone at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. Dr. Deibel, it's great to have you on the show today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me in.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question that I wanted to ask was, why practice scales? Scales are a fundamental part of a student's technical development, but why? For a young student who may not yet see the importance of scales, what might you tell them?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things that I think we all have to suffer through. It seems very sort of pedantic and not always like a lot of fun, but I think I'll probably give partially the same answer that you've gotten from some of your other guests, which is just that scales are, the basic building block of most of the pieces that we end up playing. Eventually we get to playing, maybe some more avant-garde types of music that don't have the same types of sounds or scales in them. But by and large, scales are the building blocks of most of our repertoire. So that's the first reason. And I think maybe something that doesn't get pushed as much when it comes to the importance of scales is the importance of ear training when it comes to scales. I think if you're, playing a lot of jazz, then you might encounter more of that emphasis in terms of why it's important, but it's also, it is very much an ear training thing. It's a connection between the fingers, the ears, the mind, and sometimes I think we get a little bit too wrapped up in just the idea of pushing buttons and expecting something to come out in a certain way, when it's really not the case that that's always going to happen in the same way. So,
yeah, I think that's a great answer. And, I play a bit of jazz myself, and I find that really helps kind of bolster my ability with scales and sort of bolster my understanding of scales, because, when I hear a scalar line or something in thirds or fourths, like I'll be thinking in solfege or in pitches, like, I hear what's going on with the scale rather than just, oh, that was a scale.
Yeah, and I think it's also very helpful from a standpoint of rhythm as well. And we're working on scales because we have, as saxophonists, we have lots of notes to play always, so we have, whenever we have technique in music, we have to think about those groupings, of the notes within the scale, whether that scale pattern changes within a run or whether it stays the same. The more used to all those different patterns you are when it comes to playing the actual repertoire, the less, I guess, detailed thinking you have to do. You just recognize the pattern and you've got the pattern memorized, and it just becomes much more simple, and you can take a much more big picture approach rather than thinking about every single little note, because that's the last thing you need to be thinking about when you're, playing Ibert, for example, or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think, like, from a student's perspective too, I think scales can be a little overwhelming, or just technique in general. It's like if you look at like the Legam book by Londex, for example, it's like every scale you could imagine, and it's like has a benchmark, like get these all to 144. When you see things like that, it's like, it's very like, wow, like I have a lot of work to do.
Oh yeah, it's a years long process, and I've gone back through, I think starting when I was a doctoral student at Michigan State, I wasn't asked to play scales at that time, but I took it upon myself to actually go back and recycle all of my patterns, some of which I hadn't, done maybe as well as I could have, back in the day. So I think it's something you can always revisit. And I remember I just went at it really, really carefully, and I almost developed like a little bit of muscle, not damage, but I started to feel it because I was being so meticulous in the evenness of the scales that it really made a difference in my technique at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good segue into my next question, which is, saxophonists often struggle with jaw pain and tendonitis. What are some strategies that you use to prevent RSI or repetitive strain injury?
I guess the way I would start to answer that question is just by referring to a good principle when it comes to anything technique related, when it comes to saxophone or on any other instrument really, which is to try and maintain as natural as you can those positions that your body likes to take, right? So, for example, if you're playing piano, if you're playing flute, your hands have to be in somewhat of an unnatural position, like relative to the wrist position and all that stuff. Saxophone, we actually have, I think, a pretty big advantage because the instrument is quite ergonomic. It encourages a natural hand position, and I often have my students just, I say, hold out your hand and look at the natural curvature to your fingers, and that's a really helpful thing to notice because you realize that, oh, my hand is kind of already formed to what it needs to be shape-wise to get the fingers on the pearls and everything else. And even, when it comes to the palm keys, the modern instruments are pretty well designed to, allow us to keep that natural hand position. So that's one thing. And that is just a part of the idea of trying not to over-manipulate anything when it comes to musculature or, jaw tension or anything like that. And I'll say more about that in just a second. I just kind of go back to that sort of Occam's razor concept, which is the simplest, it's really the simplest explanation is the correct one, but here it's the simplest, for me, it's the simplest hand position. The least manipulation is the right way to go because you can maintain a lot better control. Along with the other thing about the wrist and the hand position is to know that there's two sets of muscles on the arm. There's one on the bottom, which flexes when we make a fist, and you'll feel a little bit on the top, but it's those top muscles that are the extenders for the fingers. And so if we play with straight fingers, you can feel the tension in your forearm. But what you're doing is you're having those two sets of muscles fight each other basically, and that's why you can't play as fast, or you can't play with the fluidity that you can when you have that natural hand position. So I think that's one thing. I will have students definitely stretch their hands and their forearms, making sure that they're, not getting tight here. I will constantly reference taking your own temperature in terms of like how much tension do you feel in the fingers. I'm always encouraging my students to revisit or visit for the first time in some cases and revisit later on a long packet of fingering exercises that I have. I think I have like a 24-page fingering exercise packet. Some of them come from the end of the Rubank book. If you remember your advanced Rubank, there's a bunch of finger exercises. Those are in there along with a bunch of other ones. But by working on those very, small idea things, 3 notes at a time, 4 notes at a time, we can really practice not just the actual technique, but we can actually practice staying comfortable and staying relaxed when we're playing fast. And that's the real way to achieve like velocity and having it feel easy and not so labored. Another thing I guess to mention with fingers is when things get really fast and really repetitive, that's another way to introduce tension. So what I'll often say to students is think less about the putting down of the finger and think more instead about the lifting of the finger when it comes to getting fast and keeping light in technique. So those are a couple of things that I have my students think about on a regular basis, and I'm always just keeping a watchful eye just to make sure that I don't see that tension creeping in because it's usually visible. I think when it comes to the jaw thing, I've had a couple of students that have been dealing with that over the last year or so, and I would say I try to get them to think about, because I actually do keep a fairly tight embouchure, like relative to saxophonists in general. I'd say I have not tension, but I'm quite focused and firm with my embouchure. And I stress to my students the idea of centering whatever pressure or whatever, I don't know, I don't like to use the term biting, but whatever they're trying to do embouchure-wise in terms of that grip on the saxophone mouthpiece, I try to get them to center it around the concept of the airstream being very focused. And so it's not like you're like really biting down with your teeth like that, but you're maintaining that shape of the airstream that really encourages, I'd say, a balance between the muscles in the front, where your lips meet the actual mouthpiece, the cheek muscles, and then the actual jaw muscles, which really and truly are what we use to bite, for example. But again, avoiding that biting thing is pretty important to that whole process. But it's really centered around the airstream shape for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, a lot of these core ideas are like reducing tension, reducing co-contraction of muscles,
Hmm.
and really reducing the amount of movement or physical effort,
Yep.
that goes into playing the instrument. It's interesting that you brought up like flexor and extensor tendons and how
Hmm.
curving your hands and how the saxophone's kind of advantageously designed for that.
Hmm.
Curving your hands uh, eliminates a lot of that co-contraction in your forearms. But it is interesting, you said the palm keys and everything, and the side keys are really well designed for that. It's interesting too. That's also has a lot to do with hand shape,
Yeah, of
and
course.
like
Yep.
I have to raise my palm and my side keys because I just have very long fingers, so it's very easy for me to slip into a more flat fingered technique.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we're all individuals. We have our own differences, and everyone's a bit different in terms of the size of hands and everything else. So, again, I go back to that concept of trying to keep, as you said, the simplest movement or the least amount of movement. And yeah, some people might need palm risers. I used to fly off, as many people have in the past, fly off of the palm keys whenever, or off the pearls rather, when it was time to play palm keys. But over the years, I feel like my hands have started to maintain a much closer position to the pearls, even when I do have palm key work to do. Because usually we have to go right back to the pearls, right? So it's not very efficient to be lifting your fingers. But at the same time, that's really specific to the situation. If you're playing Rolling Thunder or something like that, and you got that 16th note passage with the, you don't have to go back down to the palm key. So maybe it's okay to maintain like a little bit more straightness if that helps you out. So I would just be taking my own temperature as well as, encouraging students to, be aware. It's like a body awareness thing, do you feel that tension or does it feel relaxed? And whatever keeps you relaxed is usually the right answer.
Yeah, that's really helpful because I think sometimes, you hear very specific ideas from teachers like you should do this or this is the best way to
Hmm.
do this, and sometimes there's a little more nuance there. I think especially with, an individual's technique and hand position, hand shape, you know.
Absolutely. So yeah, another part of this, I think, is that sometimes these technical passages that we play, we can start to imagine them in their own shape almost. So it's not just like, note A, B, C, D, X, Y, whatever, but those together will start to take on their own sensation of a gesture that you might make with your hand, and paying attention again to what makes that most efficient when you have to do some of these acrobatics that we have to do on the side keys or palm keys. That's something to lean into, I think, and start to notice.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Hmm.
So a question that I always ask in this podcast is, from a teacher's perspective, how do you strike the balance between encouragement and criticism while helping students reach their full potential as an artist?
Ooh, that's the $1 million question right there. Well, I think that there's over the years. I fortunately have never had to experience it, but I know that in olden days, there used to be a more draconian sort of tyrannical sort of approach to teaching. The criticism being the emphasis there, and like shaming people and doing things. I'm not like I don't subscribe to that. I think that music is a joy for me, to do personally, and even more importantly to share with others. That's why I do what I do, is because of that working with people aspect of it, and unlocking thoughts and ideas and everything else is just one of the great joys of life. So I think that you need both. There's no way that you can, progress without criticism and encouragement. So I take an approach of brutal honesty, combined with loving my students to death until until they can do what they need to do, right? So I'm there to be brutally honest, but I will provide all of the tools that I can, and encouragement that I can to get them. I mean, I'm not going to ridicule them. I don't do that. I'm not a yelling type of a teacher, right? But I think honesty is really important, because if you're not honest, then you're not going to hold the standards that need to be held, and students won't get what they need, because that's what students want, is to be challenged most of the time, at least. They want that challenge, and if we're not providing that, then we're really doing them a disservice. So yeah, brutal honesty, followed by total support, unwavering support, and as many ideas as I can throw at the student to help them out.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you bring up some of those ideas of, like, older school shame and blame pedagogy, things that are I think more common in more established instruments in the classical tradition, like piano, violin, for instance, kind of some things that sort of became okay over a certain amount of time, that I think in the saxophone world you don't see as much of that, even though you still have a flourishing community of really high level players. But
Absolutely.
I don't think I've met a saxophonist who I thought was rude or too intense, but at the same time, it's like everybody still, at this level, at the collegiate level, takes it seriously.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the most important pieces of skill that you can pick up as a student along this journey, and I would say maybe even especially as an undergraduate student. I was going to say more so as a graduate student, but even from the very beginning, is how to work with people, and how to interface and be diplomatic, and all of those aspects of this job that will be the things that get you asked back for the gig, or be the things that make your colleagues want to work with you in the studio, or between studios, or whatever it happens to be. I mean, if you don't have those people skills, or you're rough around the edges, as you were saying, like, you're not going to get that call. And there's plenty of great musicians, who have been very difficult to work with over the years, and they tend not to get those same calls. Yeah, I used to run the jazz festival in Wichita, and like you said, no musician that we invited into the festival was anything other than like perfectly nice, super down to earth. Even, and I'm talking about like people like Pat Metheny and Joe Lovano, and people of that caliber. I mean, these guys are all very, very kind individuals, and I think you can't. I've said it before in some interviews with Van Dorn. Being a good musician is really a lot about being a good human being. I think the two go hand in hand. Not everyone is like that. I would disagree with you maybe a little bit on that point. I think that there's still a lot of musicians walking around that are not so keyed into that, which is unfortunate. But this is part of the whole equation here, of course, is emotion. I think when emotion comes into play, as it often does when it's either a situation of making music together, or teaching, or giving and receiving criticism and feedback, emotions can run high. And so when I say honesty, it's really with that in mind, that it's not presented with an emotional content or emotional bent to it, I guess you could say. It's really about, like, this is the case of what you're playing. It sounds like this, and the honesty takes I try to have it take a non-emotional. All right, I try to take a non-emotional approach to it, and I try to show that in the way that I deliver the information, so that there's no like you said, feeling of shame and blame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you brought up the jazz festival that
Hmm.
you were part of, and how I think I've spent a lot of time around jazz musicians, and that strikes me too as kind of the general culture. I mean, it's about collaboration and playing together, because if you have to get up on a bandstand with people you don't know a
Hmm.
lot,
Oh yeah.
and if you rub them the wrong way, they won't want to play with you again.
Yep.
And, I think it is the same in classical music, but we have this, I think, sort of emphasis on individual preparation and exactness that some people take very far, and it
This is
so
true.
yeah, so and that can rub people the wrong way.
Oh,
And
for sure.
if you're that guy, in an orchestra or in a band, you know we'll
Yeah,
see we'll
yeah.
see if they want you back again, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add something that's a little bit of a departure from what we're talking about, but one of the most important things that I took with me from working in that world in Wichita over those 6 years that I was there was the openness that you sort of hinted at that pervades the jazz community. And what I had noticed when I was working with a lot of those guys is that those guys will go and they'll take a lesson with someone. I'm talking about, my friend, I have a friend, Jeff Harshbarger, who's like the first call bassist or one of the first call bassists in Kansas City. An incredible musician, he's played with everybody. And, he told me one time we were hanging out somewhere and asked him what he was doing over the summer. He's like, I'm going to go take a lesson with this guy, blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, really? And then that became something that I noticed more and more. And that's something that I don't know what your perspective is on it, but I feel like that doesn't happen when we're talking about classical musicians. We get done with our doctors and I'm like, okay, now I'm the expert and I don't need to, take any more lessons. But something that was very, I think that openness and that willingness to, seek constant improvement by learning what we can from others, in that lesson situation, that was really a powerful thing for me to observe and I've brought into my own practice as well. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. I've noticed that as well. The jazz studies students at MSU are just constantly asking each other, like, well, not only do they just randomly set up and play a few tunes with their friends, they'll I think they visit each other when they're practicing. And they're like, hey, let's, play through this. What do you think about this? Or I'm having trouble with this. One time I was practicing and I walked by a friend of mine. He's a jazz pianist. I walked by his practice room, and this kid, I mean, he's an incredible jazz pianist. I'm not a jazz studies major. It's not my main area of focus, but I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna just interrupt him for a minute and play Have You Met Miss Jones with him and screw up my solo and just listen to what he has to say. So we played the tune together and we talked for, I don't know, 25 minutes, half hour, just about the tune, about improvisation, about form. And I felt like I learned more in that 30 minutes or whatever than I could have in 3-4 hours of practicing the tune on my own.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and like you said, I think classical musicians often want to check all the boxes, so to speak, and
Hmm.
and be done and be the expert, like you said.
Yeah.
Um,
It may have something to do also with the fact of that sort of vision or paradigm of the solitary artist, like struggling alone, and that's kind of a trope I think in the classical music world that kind of came about during the Romantic time period. But yeah, I mean, great example. That this is why we do this. We work with people, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring up that sort of image of the solitary artist, because I think you look back and a lot of these great artists that we think of, they grew up around music. It's
Hmm.
like, sure, they probably spent a lot of individual time practicing, but they
Hmm.
also, they were familiar with music and what it is. You can't really know what it is unless you hear it.
Hmm.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, cool. So I have some non-saxophone, non-music related questions.
All right.
So the first one is, what do you like to do outside of music?
Oh, okay. A lot actually. I wish I had more time to do some of the things I like to do, but some of the things I really enjoy. Again, you've probably heard them from some other folks. I really enjoy cooking. Um, my wife is a really amazing gardener, and we've been growing a lot of our own food. We are fortunate to live in a place where you can grow for 9 months out of the year, and you have multiple growing seasons, which is great. So I've learned a lot. I didn't, I think we had a tomato patch when I was a kid for a couple of years, but that was about it, for me and growing vegetables. But I've learned a lot about it, and it's really a fascinating world. And so that's one thing. I like traveling. Fortunately, music takes us around the world pretty regularly, so that's nice. But I always like to see new places, experience new cultures. I'm a huge football fan, and by which I mean the European football. People that know me will know that. So I'm completely obsessed. I listen to a ton of soccer podcasts. I follow, a lot of the European leagues. I'm reading news stories all the time. So, and I play soccer too. I play on just like the local, rec league, a couple times a week, which I've done since, I've been playing since I was 5. So it's something that keeps me busy. What else do I like to do? I like to get out into nature. Florida is a beautiful place. We have tons of natural springs and rivers, and we're close to the beach. And I used to be a big skier, but haven't done that in a while. But yeah, I really, really like being out in nature and hiking and camping and all that good stuff. So those are some of the things I like to do.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's cool that you were into skiing as well. That's
Hmm.
been something I've been doing for a long time. I
Nice.
it's possible. So I have some family in Stockholm, Sweden. It's
Ah,
possible this winter we may be skiing in Norway, somewhere out there near their home,
beautiful.
which would be neat. I don't know exactly what the plan is, but this past winter, like I went out to Park City. I have family out there,
Ah,
and went skiing for the
amazing.
first time in a while, which was really, really refreshing.
Yeah, it's been a
See
while
that I
for
could
me.
still do it.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
need to get back out there. It's been too many years.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a little dangerous of a sport for a musician, maybe.
It
But
is true. It is true. The soccer is the same for me. I have to
mhm.
kind of be careful that I don't injure myself, and so far so good. Knock on wood.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, the next question that I have is, what are some core values that you have as a person?
Oh man, you're asking all the big ones today. Well, I think I'll go back to that honesty thing. I think that being honest with people is one of the most it's one of the qualities that I value most in people. So I try to live like that too. I'd say another one is probably kindness. Just being nice to everybody. No matter what your perception of a situation might be when you're meeting a person for the first time or in a new social situation. Especially in the music world, is a very small world, and that sort of reputation, as we were kind of talking about before, does precede you. So, I think that kindness thing, and life is just too short, to be upset all the time. Yeah, I guess I have a bit of an obsessive personality, and whenever I get into something, I really go for it 100%. So I think giving yourself mentally and with your whole heart to something that you're doing, dedicating yourself when you really believe in something is something that I try to do in my life. Um, I think another value that I probably got from the profession and from being an academic is just to continue to try and learn as much as you possibly can, to be open to new ideas. That's something that music probably has taught me as well. But I was fortunate enough to learn from my family as well. So yeah, those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can definitely relate to the obsessive personality thing. It's like whenever I get into something, like usually some kind of hobby, I'm like, this is what I'm interested in right now, and I'm gonna, focus on it. Like this summer, I hadn't, read really any fiction for a while, but then I picked up Dune by Frank Herbert. It's like notoriously like the longest, like a long science fiction novel,
Hmm.
and but I got really into it, and I read the whole thing over the summer, and I'm like reading the second book now, and it's kind of interesting. It's like I hadn't read for a while, but then I got really obsessed with this book, so I read the whole thing. Usually during the summers, I get pretty obsessed with fishing. Like I get semi
Ah.
addicted to it. I'm like, all right, when am I going fishing next?
Yeah, I just saw that movie Dune over the summer, and I had no knowledge. I knew that Dune existed, but I didn't know anything about the series or the film versions over the years. And I really enjoyed it. It made me actually want to read the book. So I guess I should read the book.
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
really incredible. I mean, it's a long read, but I think the movie really did it justice. I think it's going to come out in 3 parts too, which is pretty cool.
Mm.
So you'll kind of capture a lot of the book. Some movies really rush through it. So I
Yeah,
think
I really enjoyed that
yeah.
first movie that just came out. Yeah. I guess maybe one other thing that I would mention for values would be sort of a sense of justice and equity. I think, this is a couple of themes that have come up a lot more as we as a society have, recognized the things that go on that we might not be aware of as in terms of being privileged people. And so that's something that I've tried very hard to bring into my teaching and my studio over the last couple of years is ways to encourage that in my students with, the repertoire that we play, the activities that we engage in, the language that we use, the way that we treat each other, all that stuff. It's hard to sometimes feel like you have a contribution to make when it comes to that sort of thing. We're just, tucked away in the ivory tower, laboring for not too many people, like who cares about what we do, but I think that there are things that we can do in music that will benefit society on those levels. So something that's been more of a recent value that I've been trying to live out.
Yeah, definitely an inspiring way to think about it. Sometimes it's like if I really make an effort to show that I care about, diversity, equity, etc., will it really matter? Me being a privileged person and an artist, what will I actually be doing for the
Hmm.
community? But, I've been talking about this, with friends lately, like especially what we're doing right now to try and diversify classical and art music repertoire in competitions, performances. I think some people get a little rubbed the wrong way by it. And I always counter with, okay, well, maybe you want to play what you want to play, which is fair. You should play what you want to play. But also we need to make a conscious effort to diversify the repertoire.
Mm.
Then in the future, maybe that won't even be something we have to think about as much anymore.
Mm.
Maybe, people of all races, colors, religions will be able to compose and we won't even think, oh, this is by a black composer.
Mm.
Or this is by a white composer. We'll just think like, oh yeah, I know that composer. That's a good piece. It
Hmm.
won't even be, so if we work now toward these things, and maybe in the future, it'll really pay off. Which
Oh,
I think,
absolutely.
yeah, I think people still get rubbed the wrong way by it. And I just always have to like counter with, okay, well, I'm sorry you have this minor inconvenience right now. That you have to play a different piece for a
Right.
competition. Sorry. But,
Right.
maybe in 20, 30 years,
Yeah, for sure. And the thing I've become more wary of, and this is a very hard thing to discern, but you mentioned, will it matter if I appear to care more about those things? So it's like being cognizant of performative actions versus real, steps that we take. And I think we're getting better at that, but it's always something we have to kind of hold our hands up and say, as people that are in that privileged position, there's always more for us to learn. No matter how many books I read on the subject or conversations I have, this world is not so clear cut. There's a lot of gray areas. We have to be flexible and to know that we have to have a little bit of humility and to make changes that are really meaningful.
yeah, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
definitely a learning process.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Absolutely.
Deibel.
Oh.
This has been awesome. Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 9 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest Dr. Geoffrey Deibel, professor of saxophone at Florida State University. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Guillaume Ra, piano. I'm Owen Robinson, and this has been The Well-Rounded Saxophonist. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to practice smart and stay healthy.